Hi everyone, this is Jen Palmer with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 800 educators, staff, students, and researchers committed to the transformation of higher education through contemplative methods. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society. Today I'd like to welcome you to our March webinar, The Science of Contemplative Practice and the Practice of Contemplative Science, with Dr. Aaron Godlaski. We'll be having a 45-minute presentation and a 10-minute question and answer period. Dr. Aaron Godlaski serves as Assistant Professor of Behavioral Neuroscience and Psychology at Centre College in Danville, Kentucky. Dr. Godlaski's research focuses on component processes and outcomes of contemplative practice and the role of these processes in the promotion of well-being. While his research studies focus on a variety of health outcomes, he is most interested in effects on the cardiac system as indicators of central nervous system change. As the director of the Contemplative Studies Initiative at Centre College, Dr. Godlaski and a group of 4 other faculty are working to bring contemplative pedagogical practices to both curricular and extracurricular activities. The initiative has spawned several contemplative practice and reading groups, a student club, and a recent Southern Regional workshop on contemplative teaching. So welcome, Dr. Godlaski.
Thanks, Jen, for the very kind introduction. Thanks for everybody who's taking time out of their afternoon for the webinar. Hopefully you'll get some enlightening information out of the experience. So I've got a lot of words and a lot of slides, so why don't we go ahead and get started. So today I wanted to talk to you about a couple different areas in contemplative science and science of contemplative practice. One, I want to talk a little bit about science and practice, how they can be mutually informative and how at times that maybe they're at contention with one another, and some of the experiences that I've had in terms of how that's played out as a member of Association for Contemplative Mind, and over the last couple of years talking with people engaged in both science and practice of contemplation. After that, I want to talk a bit about some of the research that I've been conducting in contemplative science. And as it had said in the introduction to the webinar that went out initially, talking both sort of about successes in that area, but also failures and sort of what I've learned over time from some of the studies that maybe didn't go exactly like I had hoped they would, but nonetheless led to some positive learning experiences. And then I want to talk a bit, hopefully, given time, about conceptualizing and communicating contemplative science. That is sort of how we speak about contemplative practice, how we speak particularly with colleagues that maybe are unfamiliar with contemplative practice, that maybe just see it as meditation or only as mindfulness, or the administrators that we work with in sort of trying to set up these sorts of programs on our campuses, if that's something that you're interested in doing or you've already done, talking a bit about my experience and my colleagues' experience in doing that. And then also presenting a little bit of a new model that's come out in the psychology and neuroscience literature just a few months ago that sort of seeks to create kind of a framework from which to talk about contemplative practice and the study of contemplative practice. And then a bit about sort of our identity as contemplative scientists, and what is it about contemplation that we can draw from, not just to study subject in science, but also change the way maybe we actually approach the scientific process, and tie this somewhat back in with this idea of success and failure in the work that I do. So to start off with science and practice, I definitely think science and practice in contemplative studies really should be mutually informative endeavors. The direct knowledge that we gain through practice should aid in the development of critically informed methodologies, new scientific hypotheses for carrying out research, not just on contemplation itself, but also the practice of contemplative, pedagogy. Simultaneously, these new methods and hypotheses can feed back into and inform the ways in which we engage students in the use of contemplative pedagogy. So I am talking a bit about sort of how we assess what we do, what are we doing when we're doing what we're doing in the classroom. and try and use some of my own work to highlight this process, as it's really been a give and take between personal practice as well as my professional work as a scientist. There are a few areas of concern. I don't really like to call these problems so much as, but things that we, I think, really should keep in mind as practitioners, as teachers, and if there are those of you out there who are also engaged in the research process with regards to contemplative practice. The first one is the use of contemplative practices, or the study of contemplative practices in a laboratory setting versus the use of contemplative practices in the classroom and how they're assessed. So in making a case for contemplative pedagogy, and I did this myself, sort of coming from the scientific literature and from a clinical psychology background, used a great deal of the research findings from things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, the neuroscience of contemplative practice that comes out of like Richard Davidson's lab, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, or Clifford Saren's work out of University of California, and talking about how, you know, these are positive things that can occur as a result of contemplative practice. And while these studies are conducted in laboratory settings, I think it's important to sort of keep in mind that the laboratory in the classroom or the therapeutic setting in the classroom are really fundamentally different places. And so while we can, I think, make some generalization of the laboratory research that's available and that continues to grow as a body of literature in psychology and neuroscience, that we need to be careful how much of that information we sort of allow to cross over into our assumptions about what happens in the classroom. And I think it's really important that we continue to move forward in looking at the effects of contemplative practices within the special population of working with students, both in higher ed and in secondary education and in elementary school education, about what's happening in these particular places with these particular individuals as they engage in these practices, and that information is going to become incredibly powerful, I hope, in making the case for changing the way in which we engage in education. So I think while the literature from lab-based methodologies is very important, very useful, I think we really do need to continue to expand out into using the classroom as a new laboratory. And this is slowly growing. I'd like to see it sort of continue to do so. Another area of concern is this idea of practitioner versus scholar versus scientists. I mean, how we identify as teachers or as scientific researchers or as a practitioner-scholar, and you can, you know, hyphenate these terms kind of in any way you want to sort of identify who you are. But important to keep in mind that our fields, that is particular areas in which we are trained, the way in which we essentially kind of view the world and approach this object of contemplation or this experience of contemplation, is going to inform how we speak about it. That is what our values are in terms of what we think is important. So, you know, as a scientist, I'm particularly interested in coming up with testable hypotheses, identifying what works in what situation and what doesn't work in certain situations, and looking at outcomes. So whereas I may be particularly interested in assessment, somebody taking a more practitioner-scholar approach may be less interested in sort of outcome and more interested in fidelity of practice, or interested in following part of their own kind of ideas of practice. And I think at times we do occupy different positions with different goals. And I think I've seen this play out in discussions on the C-Mind listserv, in discussions at conferences, and that there are times where we're talking across purposes in terms with one another, and sometimes it's sort of the language that we use that may be sometimes ill-defined. I think it's important to keep in mind our identities and what we want to see happen, and try and collaborate as much as possible throughout the process, rather than sort of keep the research to the scientists and keep the practice to the pedagogues. That really sort of working together is going to ultimately be, I think, the most effective and most fruitful position to take. And then the last area of concern that stems really from this, and possibly an idea of assessment, is dealing with sort of fidelity versus freedom. And sort of talking a bit here about the idea of fidelity of practice requiring maybe some degree of established standards. And in part a discussion that I'd had along or within the listserv with a number of different people and kind of followed for a while, that played out a few months ago, brought up this question of standards, which very quickly was kind of turned into the word standardization, which I think bothered a lot of individuals. And I'm not necessarily, again, a proponent of standardization, but I think having some standards of the idea of what we're doing, as a teacher and as a scientist. I am trained, as many other people are trained, in to a particular bar, right? We have particular expectations about our expertise and our ability to carry out our work, and that I don't know if this necessarily would restrict freedom in an appreciable way, but trying to balance this idea of how do we maintain the fidelity of what we're doing. That is, how do we establish our expertise in this area as it grows, as contemplative studies hopefully continues to become a legitimate field of study, without sacrificing too much of our freedom as educators and as practitioners to do what we do with our students. In general, I think that basic and applied research and scholarship in the area, as well as assessment, are really necessary components of legitimizing the field, of saying this is the work that we're doing, and it appears to work well, and that the practices that we are engaging in do have a positive effect in students' lives. But we need to see, I think, that bear out in the arena of peer-reviewed assessment of published work, because we would expect, I think, no less from sort of any other area of study. So one thing that I had mentioned initially in my presentation of the talk was the idea of, do we view this as dichotomy or as dialectic? That is, do we think of science and practice as an ongoing conversation, or do we think of science and practice as being two really separate entities? And I think there are real problems with talking about contemplative practice in a dichotomous way, or science and practice as a dichotomy. One is that in dichotomy, we sort of isolate ourselves into two camps, and that really limits our capacity for communication with one another. Again, practice informing scholarship, and scholarship subsequently informing practice, if we think of them as being separate. This is really going to ultimately lead to poorly informed research as well as practice in the area. We're not really going to know, what we're doing, and when we're doing it, we're not going to know if it's going to have sort of a good effect or not. This is going to limit our growth in both contemplative practice as well as contemplative science, or sorry, contemplative pedagogy as well as contemplative science. If you want to think of those things as being sort of two separate categories. I know not everybody that's engaged in contemplative pedagogy is doing science in this area. But in terms of growth of these two areas within the larger field of contemplative studies, is going to be stunted somewhat by an unwillingness to communicate with one another and to, I think, work collaboratively through the research process and through the institution of practice. This also tends to follow kind of a traditional paradigm, that is sort of a historic idea of when you have a group of individuals that are particularly interested in one area and another group of individuals interested in another, where you bifurcate the two separate areas. And this is something that in my own field of psychology, saw play out over the latter half of the 20th century, in that the American Psychological Association, which was largely made up of individuals doing clinical practice work, who were not researchers, who were not, we would say, bench scientists or interested in sort of pure research in psychology, sort of taking over that organization, and that a number of scientists had left the APA and formed the Association for Psychological Science, which is really just sort of the research side of this process. And while they're clinical researchers in APS, they may not communicate as much as those with an APA. And so the question is that a kind of bifurcation that we want to see happen? when we're sort of given this opportunity to essentially create a new field? And I would say no. I think if we considered a dialectic or a conversation or seeing this sort of union of two things that are different from one another but are mutually informative, that begins to foster communication. That people engaged in pedagogy, speaking with those that are doing research or doing research of their own, those doing research speaking with people who are doing the pedagogy, able to develop, again, better means to carry this out both in research and in practice. So research informs practice, practice ultimately informs research, and it becomes this very mutually beneficial circular process. And ultimately, hopefully, legitimizes the work that we're doing. This also, I think, really honors the contemplative identity of wanting to, I think, work together collaboratively, to be open to a variety of opinions and ideas, and to engage in a sort of open exploration of experience, both internal and within groups or with other individuals. So I want to shift a bit from there and talk a bit about conducting research in this area, my own experience there, and like I said, some of the experiences that I've had, how they've been effective and ineffective at times, and how even myself maybe engaging more in sort of a dichotomous process, even internally, right? So sort of not connecting what I know from my own experience or what I know from my own scholarship in contemplation with the science that I'm directly doing. So this is a dichotomy that can even sort of play out within a person as opposed to just say within two groups of people. And, you know, kind of learning over time, oh, wow, looking back, I should have known better with the work. So as Jen had said, my research interest is in contemplative practice as well as cardiac physiology. I'm a health psychologist by training. And have been sort of working in the area of, I would say, contemplative studies and contemplative science for about the last 4 years. And a very sort of common question that I get from people when talking about my research, even my own sort of colleagues within a small college of only sort of just over 100 faculty, the question of, you study meditation, right? And it's a reasonable question, and I understand sort of where it comes from, but I feel at times it's a bit like asking a biologist if they study life, that there's so much more to contemplative practice than just meditation or just mindfulness or just a particular maybe philosophical backgrounding in contemplative practice. That while I have very sort of broad research interests, I really, for the sake of functionality in my lab, being at a small university, or sorry, a small college, that you kind of have to break down the object a bit. And I certainly don't see myself as like an eliminative reductionist, where I'm trying to sort of chip away at the thing until I have its sort of smallest constituent part. But I do try and approach contemplative practice and contemplative science from a component process approach. Excuse me. So basically this idea of component process is that the idea that contemplation or contemplative practice is made up of a variety of sort of both sort of, we could say, sub-objects or subcomponents or ongoing processes. So you have a variety of cognitive abilities, a variety of behaviors, affective states that give rise to particular experiential outcomes. And so I'm interested in contemplative practice as something that can be engaged in and result in sort of being able to look at outcomes in any of these areas. So how does things like sustained attention on breath or intentionally cultivating a particular mindset like cognitive reappraisal or gratitude affect a variety of possible outcomes. And like I said, I'm interested in the cardiovascular system as a measure of autonomic arousal, central nervous system activity, but I'm also interested in health behaviors and general well-being. So for me, this sort of component process approach of looking at contemplative practice is not necessarily just being a group that experiences a meditation, intervention, and one that doesn't, and looking at the difference between the two, but simply looking at some of those internal components of meditative practice, or say of breath awareness as being one of those components, and seeing sort of what outcomes are there. Part of the reason for that is I'm in a small rural community, don't necessarily have access to sort of large groups of people in which to engage with in terms of interventions, or have access to people who are really long-time practitioners to look at. So I find kind of breaking things up in this way as a helpful way to approach the research object. I had initially sort of tried it as you know, I'm going to look at people meditating and see what happens, and sort of found it very difficult given sort of space and time and sort of other restrictions. But in terms of my research in general, I would say all of it begins with this kind of sort of internal and interpersonal experience that ultimately gives rise to some sort of intention to look at a particular object or a particular experience. So most of the research projects that I'm going to be presenting to you came out of either a personal practice experience that I had, became interested in sort of an idea of what this experience was able to observe it this kind of first-person way, try and unpack it a bit, and then try and develop a way to go about looking at it using the methodologies that I have at my disposal with the sampling community or the population that I have at my disposal. So it's either been sort of personal practice driven or through collaborative conversation with either other people who have practice experience or just through talking about, you know, where are areas of the literature that are lacking? You know, what are the gaps that need to be filled? One of the really sort of fascinating, exciting things about contemplative science is that there are sort of huge swaths of space, of ideas, of experience that we can begin to explore. And I think put that practice into work as scientists and as teachers. So both practice and conversation. So what are some of the studies that I've had a chance to kind of work on? I tend to split my work into qualitative and quantitative endeavors. I'm not going to talk too terribly long about any of these individually. If you have questions during Q&A or would like to follow up with me over email or talk further at some point in the future, I'm happy to do so. We've got a couple qualitative and a couple quantitative studies that I just kind of want to outline as examples and then talk about some of the not good and bad, but maybe sort of the successful, not so successful outcomes that have come from that. So the first project that I had done when I came here actually was a qualitative study that was looking at motivational processes in a short course on meditation that was being taught by one of my colleagues who's part of the Contemplative Studies Initiative in the religion department. And he was talking about teaching this course. I asked him if I could interview his students, do some focus groups before and after, and look at their experience sort of over time. And I ended up presenting this, I guess it was in 2012 at the fall conference at Amherst a few years ago, and have been kind of sitting on the manuscript ever since then. I'm sure many of you recognize how hard it is sometimes to get a paper written if you're at a small liberal arts teaching college when you're spending a lot of time with your students. But I still have the information available and still may continue to work on. I'll talk a little bit about some of the outcomes of that in a second that may be of use to some of the listeners. Second one that we're currently working on, Kyle Anderson is again another faculty member who's in the Asian Studies Department here at Center College, and he teaches Chinese language and decided to start instituting some contemplative practices with his Chinese language learning students. And we decided to do a survey analysis of their experience and try and identify what contemplative practices were really effective for them as students. And we're currently working on that, trying to prepare that manuscript. It's fairly interesting being able to establish from a large number of practices. We started with 8 or 9 and identifying really 3 core ones that were quite effective for students in their language learning experience. In terms of quantitative work, a handful of pieces I've done there, looking at cardiac physiology on a brief breath awareness training. I will admit that this study failed miserably. It was I think we collected about half the sample and ran some preliminary analyses, and did not work well. And I remember presenting it to somebody at a conference last year, just sort of in casual conversation. And they were not at all surprised why it didn't work. And I think mainly the reason that it didn't work was really we were kind of rushing into things in terms of the expectation that a very brief training would have any kind of sort of noticeable or measurable effect, and that the instructional issue, there was an instructional issue sort of with how it was carried out. But this was, I sort of use this as an example of sort of rushing in to the process, not really thinking about sort of the time necessary, the individual developmental experience necessary in seeing kind of really noticeable outcomes in contemplative practice. Again, this idea of component process comes up in the second study. This one is still somewhat ongoing. We're going to try and collect some more data with it. I have students working on it now, looking at cognitive reappraisal, sort of an example of how individuals reappraise their internal emotional experience, ideally in, say, a more positive light. We might think of it as reframing or a kind of de-reification experience, where one sort of notices a thought or a particular experience as an experience and changes the way they think about that in kind of a meta way, and looking at that outcome. So it sort of was a component of meditation that didn't really involve any kind of teaching of meditation. Obviously, we were just looking at this as a regulatory process. This is based on the work of James Gross, if anybody's familiar with the emotion regulation literature. Right now, the big thing we have going is something called the Gratitude Project. This is a 2-week online journaling intervention that asks people to periodically engage in a gratitude practice and then write about it. And then they come into the lab and we run them through a series of tests. And we're looking at a variety of health outcomes here. Preliminary data looks interesting. And so I'm very excited about this one as we've kind of expanded it outside of the normal research sample of students into the campus as a whole, and hopefully over the next year or so expanding it outwards even farther to the wider sort of community around the college, so within Danville, the town that we're in, looking at sort of the potential positive effects of actively engaging in gratitude. In terms of sort of other practice processes, I'm interested in the physiological and immunological effects of forest bathing. This is a Japanese term, basically walking in the woods for a therapeutic kind of experience. This is something that came out of the health and physiology literature in Japan a few years ago and has been popping up a little bit here and there in the US. But through some connections that I have there in Japan, I'm talking about going back, doing some training, working with some other researchers there, and coming back and trying to evaluate this idea of sort of contemplative walking in the forest, engaging in really intentional sensory experiences in the woods, but also looking at the sort of effects of being exposed to the flora in particular wooded areas that may have very positive effects on human physiology, stress, and the immune system. So this project's currently in development. We're going to get started with a student this summer, trying to frame it out and working with our local Forest Service to see that happen. And then this final one, and I only throw this up here, like I said, in case anybody thinks this sounds like fun. I've really been trying for the last year or so. I'm very close to Gethsemane Abbey, which, if you're familiar with Thomas Merton, this is the abbey that he was living in seclusion in for a number of years before his death, looking at a multi-method analysis of contemplative practice in Catholic monastics. This grew out of a conversation I had with a few folks a year or so ago in San Diego about the lack of studying of Abrahamic traditions in contemplative science and contemplative studies, and that this may be an avenue for it being sort of close. So I have sort of the location in the area. I'm interested in looking at physiology. If there's somebody out there with a mobile electroencephalogram or that's interested in being involved in this, I'd be happy to start talking about possible funding opportunities, which is sort of where things have stalled out. But in terms of what I've learned from these particular projects, from qualitative research, and I would say in some ways I've learned more from the qualitative research than I have from the quantitative research, which coming from somebody who teaches neuroscience, that may sound like heresy, but whatever, then I'm a heretic. Understanding the intentionality of participants, students, here in this case, that we were working with, I think is incredibly important in the process of conducting this kind of research. One of the things that we ran into in the study on the class on meditation and Buddhism was that the interest the students had in terms of what moved them kind of towards the course, those that were really interested in learning a skill, that is like trying to reduce their stress, or thinking that learning to meditate would make them a better student, versus those that were simply just taking the class out of a general curiosity to explore something new, actually did worse than those that were just curious. Those that were just curious tend to stick with the practice longer. They tended to meditate more regularly over the course of several weeks. They tended to talk about their experience more positively. Those that were kind of skill hunting, as it seemed like, were really frustrated and often gave up. And that those differences were pretty visible between those two groups. So recognizing really sort of where our students are in terms of their level of interest and their level of engagement is really important. I think also we should keep in mind to keep or to carry out this process slowly, right? To be very intentional about how we organize our practices, how we present them to our students. Obviously, that's going to start with having a very strong personal practice. Again, your personal practice is going to inform both practice with students, but also your research practice. So I think the breath awareness study that I had cited earlier probably would have gone a lot better if I had actually recognized the fact that the first time anybody asked me to sit for 10 minutes and watch my breath, I certainly didn't do a very good job of it. So it's important to meet students kind of where they are. And so, would it have been different in terms of the way in which the instructor had handled the class, the students that were there sort of looking for skills versus students who were there out of sort of general curiosity? Would outcomes have been better overall if things had been tailored sort of differently in the class? Maybe one of the more important things is to recognize development at sort of a multi-level or multiple levels as individuals, say, develop within practice, right? So time, I think, is important. How much time we ask students to engage in particular practices. Start short, kind of end long. Again, another thing that came up in that first qualitative study was that students that were asked to, sit for 30 minutes within sort of the first week of being exposed to practice had a lot of difficulty there. Maybe that was a bit rushed. In terms of looking within person, that is sort of what's a person's interest, what's a person's intentionality, seeing that develop over time. And then also in terms of within projects, so the structure of either the course itself that one's working on or the research project that one's working on. I think the direction that Kyle Anderson and myself are taking with the second study that I mentioned about Chinese language learning, where we're starting with this pilot survey data, and then we're going to, again, continue to try and test out some of these practices, gather more information and look at them over a longer time period to see that development hopefully unfold. And again, that's a question of sort of intentionality and recognizing that this is a project that's going to develop over time. I think really key learnings from qualitative research are that, and anybody who does qualitative work will see this as being totally obvious, but that exploration and understanding of a person's first-person experience is really necessary for developing, I think, really effective, meaningful, quantitative work in contemplative science and contemplative pedagogy. Right? So if we want to understand what people's experience is, rather than taking a strict third-person perspective, beginning to ask them, what is their experience? How do they see it unfolding over time? If I hadn't sort of made the mistakes of some of the prior quantitative work and learned from that, I would have never sort of recognized sort of the developmental process maybe as effectively as I have sort of now at this point. In terms of those lessons from quantitative research, here intentionality is important, although I think the intentionality of the researcher is really of particular import. And this extends for me also to the way in which I train my research students. So I think it's important to sort of focus specifically on their development as individuals in the research process. Also, in quantitative research, we need to be really careful about how we engage in the reductive process, how we categorize particular practices, how we sort of label particular phenomenon or particular experiences. These can be really productive in that they can constrain and operationalize processes, but at times can also be disruptive. So one difficulty is like the use of self-report measures of mindfulness or of contemplativeness, word that we're using, but these can sometimes lack reliability and validity. They can, be somewhat constraining. I think they serve very useful purposes in certain settings to look at change over time, but I think it's really important to be aware of that. There's in my references page that you'll see sort of at the end, that'll also be, I think, available if that can be sent out. The most recent article there by Richie Davidson in 2015, an American psychologist, has a really nice section on talking about the utility, but also some of the caveats of self-report and this idea of categorization. I think some of the most potentially fruitful future directions, both for myself and others, is going to be working with kind of mixed model type approaches. So looking at both first and third person, or first, second, and third person modalities. The framework that I'll present in just a second, and I'm going to have to move quickly through it. I apologize, but it's published, so it's available for anybody that wants to take a look at it. And it's not my model, so maybe it's perhaps better that you read it directly from the authors that state it. But that looking at a neurophenomenological matrix, sort of a place or a three-dimensional space in which one can place a particular contemplative practice and see development occur over time along several different continuums, provides a nice frame for that to occur. Also the component process analysis, so not necessarily just focusing on practices or pedagogical experiences as being sort of large single units, but being able to look at different parts of that process. So for example, if you're interested in assessing your student outcomes within a particular class, what are your intentions? What are you interested in seeing come out of their practice experience? And can you measure that sort of over time? For a really nice idea of how that might play out from a guided sort of assessment perspective, Grace Bullock and Sarah Kramer have a really good webinar that's also on the CMind site that talks about that process of guiding sort of the structure of a program and while keeping in mind sort of what you're assessing and how you're assessing. So I would definitely recommend that to listeners. In terms of how I put these lessons into practice, particularly with regards to student training and project development, in terms of student training, I'm obviously interested in my students being exposed to the scientific literature in contemplative science, but also engaging in first-person practice. So as working in my lab is a voluntary process, students are told when they're coming in or when they're interested in coming in and taking part in our research as research assistants, that engaging in the types of practices that we're talking about studying is an important part of that process. That is, in the same way that I can bring my own experience to inform that research, they come up with really interesting and novel questions based on their own experience as well. So project development overall can become a very collaborative experience. And the students themselves, over the last several years, I have a great group of students that I'm working with right now that are very engaged in both practice and the literature, and been involved in the developing and piloting of particularly this gratitude project that's been ongoing, based on really what was a very, I think a very sort of personally valuable experience during a meditation group where we were doing metta meditation and sort of noticing the very kind of strong sense of warmth and comfort and relaxation following that practice. And as somebody who studies the heart, it seemed like a logical place to go. And so starting to talk about that and then begin developing and piloting the study. So just an example of how that research process can grow out of first-person practice. So in general, my goals, like I said, first in research training are to provide rigorous scientific training, but also to incorporate first-person methods, both in personal development and in research practice. So helping students to begin to recognize both their personal biases and systemic biases in science that may play a role in how they interpret information, the ideas that they're interested in exploring. What does their first-person experience tell them about what a methodology might look like? So when we're piloting through a particular project, there's a lot of sort of slow work and development of maybe a particular experimental protocol, and a lot of back and forth feedback. You know, when we were developing the journal, we individually kind of went through the journal together on our own, what worked well, what didn't, reflecting back on that, seeing sort of what effects were, became really engaged in that process. In terms of future directions that I would like to see sort of in my own work is looking at multidisciplinary contemplative science training for students in other areas. So would the work that I'm doing with my students be effective with other students in the science division? We have a lot of undergraduate researchers here, and so trying to sort of branch out in that regard. I'm also trying to start to come up with some more sort of collaborative formative assessment methodologies for working with my undergraduate researchers, rather than just telling them at the end of the term whether they've done a good job or not, having them self-reflect, you know, sort of explore sort of where they feel like they need to develop, as well as where I need them to develop, and then come to some sort of mutual agreement and understanding in that process. So trying to do a lot of what basically amounts to deep listening in the assessment process of my research students. And then also needing to kind of continue to engage in some international research and practice collaboration with some of the people that I've connected with in Japan on this forest bathing projects. And certainly not doing something that's hugely novel. At least I don't think it's hugely novel. There's a lot of precedence for this in terms of structured settings. So if you're familiar with any of these programs, or if you're not, I would encourage you to look into them. The Brown Contemplative Studies Initiative, University of Michigan Jazz Contemplative Studies Initiative, and Alan Wallace's work on contemplative science. And I am running a bit short on time, so I think I will just get to go through some of the identity bits of contemplative science and practice, and then maybe we'll stop there for questions. So in terms of why I think we're in a unique position from the perspective of contemplative studies, is that some of the main challenges that we face as researchers, and so like I said, some of these research projects that failed or did not at least yield sort of useful results, none of those have been published yet. And part of that reason is this issue of publication bias. That it's sort of difficult to get work that may not necessarily sort of yield statistically significant results or yield sort of results with large effects. That's very difficult to sort of get out into the literature. Yet I think I've personally learned a great deal from those experiences, and perhaps others would as well, but it's difficult to make some of that information available. There's also this issue of the taboo of subjectivity. I think this is changing somewhat with the introduction of ideas like neurophenomenology and this increased number of studies that are being published that are calling for an adoption of first-person perspectives in mixture with third-person perspectives. So hopefully that will continue to change over time. And then also this idea of quantifying kind of what might be felt as sort of an ineffable quality of contemplative practice. That while I may not be able to get at sort of what deep transformation is, I can hopefully get close to it in some way. So I've been kind of toying around with this idea of trying to practice science without ego, right? To get rid of that idea of being sort of clear about my intentionality, about being comfortable with and willing to sort of share mistakes, works that have been unsuccessful, and then ideally learning from those errors over time. So I'll probably stop there. This is just sort of a quick show of this matrix. This is from Lutzjaw, Dunn, Sarin, 2015. I would highly recommend it to anybody sort of interested in that area or interested in the area of a framework for contemplative, for contemplative science, or for sort of operationalizing in contemplative science. But I don't think we're going to have time for it today. And then we sort of move forward to, and then I also have a list of, say, recommended readings. So if Jen can, she will post all of this. If not, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to forward my slides along to anyone who's interested. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I just wanted to remind everyone that the slides will be available afterwards. So all of the great information and resources there will be available to you. We'll try to send that out next week. So if you do have questions, and I've already received some from you, please type them into the little questions bar. And I'll allow like a minute or so of silence just so people can type in questions, and then I'll read as many as we have time for. Okay, well, I'm going to start with our first question here. What would you say, what would you say is the starting point in introducing contemplative sciences to faculty who are predominantly practitioners?
That's a great question. I'm sure they're all great, but we'll start with that one. Presenting contemplative science to people who are predominantly practitioners. I think, at least sort of from my position, I mean, in some ways I felt what I was presenting today was probably going to be presenting to lots of practitioners. I think the idea of recognizing that sort of the goal of, I hope the goal of scientific practice in this area is not necessarily to so much try and constrain contemplative practice, but to understand it. That the process of observation that we take on in practice is quite similar, if not really the same, and maybe I'd make a false distinction to say it's somehow different, that we adopt in science. Granted, science is adopting by and large, or predominantly, a third-person perspective. It still is a observational process. So I think in some ways sort of framing the position that someone takes in the first person as a practitioner or as someone who teaches this work, and saying that this is very similar essentially to what's going on in science, albeit from a slightly different perspective. But as a process, I think they are very, very similar. And I tend to think of the science that I do and the way I approach science as being very much one of trying to adopt a position of observer, somewhat sort of removed from the experience, and sort of seeing, you know, what is there, what is happening, what is going on within the process. Also like maybe a teacher practitioner perspective, I think the literature that stems from therapeutic work, using things like MBSR, or engaging in contemplative practice for work with veteran populations with PTSD. I think the scientific literature in that area maybe in some ways is kind of akin to this idea of teacher-student models, and maybe accessible there.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. And this question here is very specific, but it might provide sort of an example. Crystal is asking, if I ask students in a humanities class to self-identify where they are in their contemplative experience, how might I account for the inherent bias so I can use the information in assessment?
This is why it's nice to have a conversation when you do these things. So if you're asking students in humanities class where they are within their process, I'm going to make an assumption that this is maybe like into a period of time that students have been engaging in practice, and then accounting for bias. I think from an assessment perspective, particularly if you're talking about first-person accounts, I think simply recognizing that some bias may exist is sort of the step to take. So in a sense, you may have to ask them to bracket somewhat this idea of bias and sort of framing that, you know, I'm going to ask you to talk about where you are in your experience, and you know, recognizing that there may be some you may be a bit overzealous in your assumptions about how far you have advanced, or there may be some bias or a desire to present this idea that you're getting a great deal out of this course experience, or whatever setting it may be in, and then asking them sort of respond there. So in a sense, you're asking them to engage in a very kind of qualitative bracketing of their experience, and then, you know, seeing then what they have to say. But I think as much as you can kind of educate them on the front end, that's really, I think, the best you're going to be able to do to potentially control that bias, and just recognizing that it exists, that this may be slightly biased, but this is what they said. You know, sometimes you have to just take people at their word.
Great. So we have time for just about one more question here. And this one isn't regarding the science end of things so much, but more about your role as the Contemplative Studies Initiative Director.
Sure.
This is Michael, and he says that his university is unfamiliar with contemplative studies at all levels, administration to faculty. What was your experience building Contemplative Studies Initiative with respect to process and resistance?
Well, I in some ways, for educational purposes, I wish I could say I met with resistance and this is how I handled it. But people were profoundly supportive of what we were interested in doing. From an administrative level, there were definitely some faculty that I think were kind of benignly indifferent to the work that we were doing. But in terms of how it was initially presented, I felt that starting off with the information that was most accessible. So I did frame it from the perspective of, here are the clinical outcomes of mindfulness training. And that was an area that I was familiar with as a clinical psychologist. And sort of tried to keep it as, in a sense, kind of compartmentalized there initially as I could. So the idea being that these are some of the outcomes associated with meditative practice, particularly this type of meditation practice. And we're interested in trying to cultivate those practices more intentionally within the campus community. So it wasn't really met with a lot of resistance. I think most people were able to sort of dig into their own memory bank and think of like, oh yes, I remember reading an article about mindfulness or about meditation, or about it somewhere. So people were generally accepting of it. I think the hardest thing to overcome, I had actually thought this might be a question that would be asked, was I think many administrators might be a little bit worried about inclusiveness, about whether or not you are proselytizing, and if anyone would be offended by this. So there are issues of diversity, there are issues of the religious question, and then also these issues of sort of how you're going to be doing what you're doing. So I think if you can speak to those terms and kind of provide them with some reassurance or some idea of structure, assuming you're not interested in teaching from a particular religious stance, then that may be helpful, because I think those may be some of the concerns that are initially raised by administrators.
Great, thanks. That
Good.
question did come up a lot.
Oh,
Great.
good. Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just want to thank you again, Aaron, and thank everyone else for joining us today for this presentation. Just to remind everyone, the webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the website soon, along with the slides, so you can share it with friends or colleagues. Our webinars are made possible by your support, and we invite you to make a donation and check out our webinar archive at contemplativemind.org. Thank you for listening.